This train is supposed to have 24 wagons. The manifest says 24. The sensors read 24. But when I look back, I count 25. I took this job to see the elegant laws of physics paint the sky with auroras. Now, I'm watching those same laws break, and I'm afraid the paint is starting to run. My name is Liam, and this may be my final run. The hum is the first thing you learn to love. It's a constant, a deep baritone vibration that travels from the twin diesel-electric engines through the steel floor of the locomotive and up into the soles of your feet. It's the sound of controlled power, of 12,000 horsepower, defying a continent of ice and silence. Here in the climate-controlled cabin of the Trans-Borealis freight engine, the universe makes sense. It's a closed system of variables and constants: fuel consumption, engine temperature, track integrity, speed, distance. Everything is a number. Everything can be measured, calculated, and predicted. That's why I'm here. I'm not running from anything. I'm running to this, the beautiful, brutal simplicity of applied physics in one of the world's last true wildernesses. My official title is Senior Conductor, but it's a designation of pure irony. I'm the only one out here. My job is to shepherd nearly 3,000 tons of advanced scientific equipment and supplies from the Southern Depot to a series of isolated research outposts scattered across the Arctic Circle. The train itself is a marvel, the bleeding edge of engineering. Its dashboard is a constellation of soft blue and green lights, digital readouts displaying a constant stream of data. The GPS is accurate to within a centimeter, synced with a half-dozen satellites. The forward-facing cameras cut through snow and fog with thermal and infrared imaging. This cabin is more than a cockpit. It's a sanctuary of reason, a mobile laboratory, cutting a precise line through a world of beautiful chaos. Before my first run, I was handed the keys and a thin, worn binder by a man named Alistair, my predecessor. He had the kind of 1,000-yard stare you see in old war photos, his face a roadmap of cracked leather. He didn't say much, just pointed to the binder. "Read this," he'd rasped, his voice thin as autumn leaves. "The official manual tells you how the train works. This one tells you how to survive the tracks." I'd laughed it off, assuming it was a collection of folksy wisdom and mechanical quirks, and for the first week that's all it seemed to be. But tucked in the back, behind diagrams of fuse boxes and notes about icy switches, was a handwritten section titled, simply, "The Rules." They were bizarre, more like philosophical koans than operational procedures. Rule number 4, do not attempt to measure the distance between kilometer markers. The numbers on the GPS are the only reliable truth. Rule number 9, if the train's shadows begin to stretch in the wrong direction of the sun, or appear to move independently, stop the train. Do not exit the cabin. Wait for them to correct themselves. And the one that I found most amusing, rule now 16, the wagon count must be confirmed visually at the start of each 12-hour shift. If the count does not match the manifest, do not panic. The train is readjusting itself. Readjusting itself, I'd mumbled to myself, shaking my head with a smirk. The man had clearly spent too long alone. The isolation up here is a physical presence. It can press in on you, warp your perceptions. I was different. I had my physics. I had my numbers. I had the hum of the engine, a constant reminder of the dependable, logical world of mechanics. My second week on the run was smooth. I fell into a rhythm. The vast, empty landscape of snow and stunted taiga became a familiar canvas. The aurora borealis arrived on schedule, a predictable dance of charged solar particles meeting the magnetosphere. I watched it for hours through the panoramic windshield, a silent symphony of shimmering green and violet light. It was a perfect demonstration of the universe's beautiful, unwavering laws. Everything was exactly as it should be. The first tremor in that foundation came on a Tuesday, under a sky of painful, crystalline blue. The sun was low, a pale disk in the southern sky, casting immensely long shadows across the snow. I was in the middle of a long, straight stretch of track, the landscape hypnotically monotonous. Boredom is a real operational hazard out here, and in an effort to break it, I started running through the checklist in Alistair's binder. My eyes fell on rule number 16. The wagon count must be confirmed visually. I glanced at my main console, The diagnostic screen showed a clear green schematic of the train. 24 rectangular icons, each representing a freight wagon, all connected and reporting normal pressure and temperature. The manifest, a digital file on my tablet, listed 24 wagons. I knew with the certainty of a mathematician staring at a proven theorem that I was pulling 24 wagons. But Alistair's rule wasn't about the manifest or the sensors. It was about visual confirmation, a strange, almost unscientific insistence, a flicker of professional curiosity, mingled with that creeping boredom, made me do it. I brought the train to a gentle halt, the massive engines falling into a low, rumbling idle. The silence that rushed in was profound. I grabbed the high-powered binoculars from their cradle. Opening the side window, I was hit by a blast of frigid, sterile air that stole my breath. I leaned out, my body braced against the frame, and aimed the binoculars towards the end of my train. The wagons snaked behind me, a line of dark blue rectangles against the brilliant white snow. I started counting from the last one, the caboose, 1, 2, 3. The air was so clear I could read the serial numbers on the side of the 10th wagon. 10. The metal groaned softly as it contracted in the cold. 15. 16. I felt a small, ridiculous thrill, like a child playing a game. 20. 21. 22. 23. 24. I paused, my eye still pressed to the lens. There was another one. After the 24th wagon, there was a 25th. I pulled back, blinking. The cold was making my eyes water. Must be a trick of the light, a heat shimmer coming off the metal, though that made no sense in this sub-zero air. I shook my head, a small laugh catching in my throat. This is how it starts, I thought. The solitude gets to you. You start seeing things. I raised the binoculars again, my hands much steadier this time. I would be methodical. I would count again, slowly. I focused on the caboose, then moved my view from wagon to wagon, counting aloud in a low whisper. 22, 23, 24. I stopped. Behind wagon 24, attached to it as surely as all the others, was another wagon. It was identical in every way, the same deep blue paint, the same company logo, the same layer of frost dusting its roof. It was simply there, an impossibility hitched to the end of my train. My heart began a low, heavy drum against my ribs. I lowered the binoculars and just stared, my naked eyes confirming the impossible vision. My brain scrambled for an explanation. A clerical error at the depot. Could they have hitched an extra wagon without updating the manifest or the train's onboard diagnostic system? The idea was ludicrous. Every wagon is electronically tagged. The system would be screaming with red alerts if there was a mismatch. I scrambled back inside, slamming the window shut. The silence of the cabin was no longer comforting, it was accusatory. I stared at the diagnostic screen. 24 green icons. I rebooted the system. It took 3 minutes, the longest 3 minutes of my life. When it came back online, it still showed 24 wagons. My hands were trembling. This was a violation, not of protocol, but of basic reality. The observed evidence, what I could see with my own eyes, was in direct, irreconcilable conflict with the measured data. One of them had to be wrong, and I had built my entire life on the principle that data does not lie. I put the train back in motion, pushing the throttle a little harder than necessary. I needed the hum of the engines to drown out the frantic, illogical thoughts spiraling in my head. I didn't look back. For the next hour, I focused on my screens, on the numbers, on the tangible, reliable world of information. But I could feel the presence of that 25th wagon behind me, a silent, impossible passenger. The second violation came hours later, as dusk began to bleed purple and orange across the horizon. The feeling of wrongness from the wagon incident had subsided into a low-grade, gnawing anxiety. I was trying to lose myself in the charts, planning my approach to the Anvil Pass, a notoriously difficult section of the track that curved sharply through a narrow mountain gap. I knew this curve. I had studied the topographical maps for days. I'd even run it on a simulator. It was a sharp 35-degree turn to starboard, demanding a precise reduction in speed to 40 kilometers per hour. My GPS overlay showed the curve approaching, 5 kilometers out. The system automatically began to display the speed advisories. Everything was nominal. But when I looked up from the console, out through the reinforced glass of the windshield, my blood turned to ice. The track wasn't curving. It was straight as a laser beam running directly forward and disappearing into the darkening moor of the mountains ahead. There was no gentle sweep to the right, no sign of the pass I had memorized. There was only a straight, dark line cleaving through the snow-dusted rock. "No," I whispered, my voice hoarse. I checked the GPS again. It showed my train as an icon moving steadily along a sharply curved line. The forward camera feed, displayed on the screen to my right, also showed the straight track. My eyes and my cameras agreed. The map, the GPS, the train's entire navigational system disagreed. Rule number 2 flashed in my mind, unbidden. Trust the maps, not the landscape. This was insane. It was a system failure, it had to be. A catastrophic navigational glitch. My eyes were showing me reality. A straight track. If I followed the system's advice and maintained my approach for a curve that didn't exist, I would be fine. If I actually turned, I would derail the entire train into a wall of solid granite, 2 kilometers to the supposed curve. The automated voice, calm and feminine, chimed through the cabin. "Upcoming starboard curve. Please reduce speed to 40 kilometers per hour." My hand hovered over the manual override, ready to disconnect the autopilot that would try to take the non-existent turn. My entire being, every rational instinct, screamed at me to trust what I was seeing. But the memory of the 25th wagon held me back. My eyes had lied to me then, or had they? 1 kilometer. The tension in the cabin was a physical thing. My heart was a frantic hammer. I looked from the impossible straight track outside to the GPS screen, showing the sharp, undeniable curve. 2 conflicting realities presented to me at once, and I had to choose which one to live in. Alistair's face flashed in my memory, his dead eyes, the desperate rasp in his voice. "This one tells you how to survive." With a strangled sob of pure terror, I took my hand off the override. I put my faith in the numbers. I let the train's automated system take control. I squeezed my eyes shut, bracing for the sickening, grinding screech of metal on rock, for the violent, final impact. The train did not slow for a turn. The speed remained constant. But then, something happened that I will never be able to properly describe. The world outside didn't turn. The landscape didn't move. It folded. It bent. For a single, heart-stopping second, the straight line of the track ahead of me seemed to crease down the middle, like a piece of paper, pulling the mountains and the sky with it. The horizon tilted at an impossible angle. There was no sensation of momentum, no centrifugal force. One moment, I was heading straight. The next, the view outside the window had snapped into a new position, and I was perfectly aligned in the middle of the 35-degree curve, the track now winding ahead of me exactly as the map had promised. I opened my eyes. I was alive. The train hummed along, its passage smooth and untroubled. The digital displays were all green. The world outside was, once again, rational. But I knew what I had seen. The very geometry of space had been violated and then corrected, right in front of me. The laws of physics are not suggestions. They are the fundamental architecture of existence, at least that's what I used to believe. Now I don't know what to believe. Something is wrong with this place. Something is wrong with this train. The rules in Alistair's binder aren't the ramblings of a madman. They're a field guide to a reality that is coming apart at the seams, and I am driving a 3,000-ton train straight through the middle of it. If you want to see just how deep this deviation goes, subscribe to this channel. I have a feeling my journey is just getting started. The human mind is a masterful editor. In the face of an event that shatters its understanding of the world, it scrambles to find a narrative, any narrative, to stitch reality back together. For the first hour after the topological violation, the only term I could conjure for the track folding in on itself, my brain served up a platter of palatable lies. A micro-seizure, a transient ischemic attack, hypoxia induced by the high-altitude, low-pressure environment. I clung to these diagnoses like a drowning man to a splinter of driftwood. They were terrifying, yes, but they were medical, they were explainable, they were internal. They meant the world outside was still sane even if I wasn't. But the hum of the engine was a constant, objective counter-argument. It hadn't changed pitch. The diagnostic systems reported no gravitational anomalies, no temporal shifts. By every metric available to me, the train had proceeded along a standard track. The data was clean. The data was pure, which left only one horrifying conclusion. My brain wasn't broken. The universe was. That thought was a precipice, and staring down into it, I felt a vertigo far more profound than any physical height could induce. I had to pull back. I had to force logic onto the illogical. A scientist, when faced with an impossible result, does not discard it. They question the premises of the experiment. My experiment was this journey. The constants were the laws of physics. The variables. What were the variables? The Arctic environment, my own psychology, the train itself, and the cargo. My attention snapped to the manifest on my tablet, my fingers suddenly cold and clumsy as I tapped the screen. I scrolled past the mundane listings, emergency rations, drilling components, medical supplies, until I found it. Wagon 12, the centerpiece of this entire run. Item, KFS Prototype 07. Description, quantum field stabilizer, passive calibration unit. Weight, 45.3 metric tons. Handling protocol, Class 4, inertial dampening must be maintained. Unit is extremely sensitive to gravimetric shear and electromagnetic fluctuation. Under no circumstances is the Faraday cage of Wagon 12 to be deactivated mid-transit. Unit is inert, emitting zero radiation, but remains a critical asset. It sounded impressive and arcane, standard fare for the kind of theoretical physics research conducted at the pole. A passive unit. Inert. The words were meant to be reassuring, to paint a picture of a dormant, harmless piece of machinery. But now they seemed like lies. What if it wasn't passive? What if this stabilizer was failing, or a far more terrifying thought, what if it was working? What if its function was to stabilize a quantum field, and in doing so, it was destabilizing everything around it? Suddenly, Alistair's binder of rules was no longer the diary of a lonely man succumbing to cabin fever. It was a technical manual, an addendum to the official schematics written by a field technician who had discovered the machine's true operating parameters. The rules weren't superstitions, they were axioms for a new, localized physics. Rule number 16. The train is readjusting itself. It wasn't a poetic turn of phrase, it was a literal statement. The extra wagon I'd seen wasn't a hallucination. It was a topological ghost, a momentary duplication of space-time caused by the device in Wagon 12. A side effect. Rule number 2. Trust the maps, not the landscape. The device wasn't just affecting the train, it was projecting a field, a bubble of consistent reality. Inside that bubble, the map was correct. Outside of it, the landscape was provisional, malleable. The track hadn't bent. The bubble of reality generated by the cargo had simply moved, carrying us with it, forcing the external world to conform to our predetermined path. I was not a conductor driving a train through the wilderness. I was the pilot of a tiny mobile reality, navigating through a sea of chaos. This hypothesis, as insane as it sounded, was the only one that fit all the data points, including my own terrifying observations. A cold wave of something that felt disturbingly like intellectual excitement washed over my fear. I was a physicist who had stumbled upon the greatest, most terrifying discovery in human history, and I was trapped inside the apparatus. My mission changed. It was no longer about getting supplies from point A to point B. It was about gathering data. It was about understanding the nature of this field and, if possible, surviving it. I turned my personal voice recorder on, not to leave a panicked final message, but to begin a proper log. Log entry 1, I began, my voice steadier than I expected. Subject, spatiotemporal anomaly linked to KFS Prototype 07. Hypothesis. The KFS unit is generating a localized, stable reality field, henceforth referred to as the bubble. This field contains the train and a minimal amount of surrounding track space. External reality appears to be fluid and subject to change. The rules outlined by the previous operator, Alistair, are to be treated as operational laws for navigating within this bubble. I will now attempt to verify the bubble's properties. My first test was time. I looked at my personal wristwatch, a high-quality analog chronometer. Then I looked at the train's master clock, which was synced to the atomic clock in Colorado via satellite. They were identical, down to the second. According to the rules of the bubble, time inside was stable, but what about outside? I couldn't exactly leave, but I could observe. I fixed my gaze on the sun's position. At this latitude and time of year, its descent towards the horizon should be a slow, almost imperceptible crawl. For the next 15 minutes, I timed its movement against the jagged peaks in the distance. My calculations were rough, but the conclusion was unmistakable. The sun was setting nearly 8% faster than it should be. Time was flowing differently outside the bubble. The implications were staggering. Was I moving faster through time? Or was the world outside moving slower? Or was the very concept of a universal flow of time a fiction? The next rule on the list that I could actively test was 22. It was one I had previously dismissed as pure poetry. Rule 22. If local wildlife, bears, moose, caribou, stops and stares at the train in absolute silence, they are not looking at the train. They are looking through it. Ignore them and maintain speed. For hours the landscape was a sterile diorama of rock and ice. Nothing moved. Then, as I rounded a wide, sweeping bend that opened onto a vast frozen plain, I saw them. A herd of caribou. Dozens of them, scattered across the tundra, their thick coats blending with the dun-colored mosses that clung to the frozen earth. And they were all perfectly still. It wasn't the cautious stillness of an animal sensing a predator. It was an unnatural, absolute freeze, as if they were statues carved from stone. Every head was turned in my direction. As the train bore down on them, a behemoth of noise and steel, they did not scatter. They did not run. They just stood there watching. My conductor's training screamed at me to sound the horn, to brake. But Alistair's rule, my new scripture, held me fast. Ignore them and maintain speed. I kept my hand steady on the throttle. The train drew closer. 50 meters. 30. I could see the frost on their whiskers, the dark, placid voids of their eyes. And then I saw what the rule truly meant. They weren't looking at the train. Their gazes were convergent, all focused on a single point in space, about 30 meters to my right. A point in empty air. They were staring intently at something I couldn't see, something that was traveling parallel to me. As my locomotive passed the first of the caribou, its head did not turn to follow me. Its gaze remained locked on that empty spot. It was as if I wasn't there. The noise of my engines, the screech of the wheels on the rails, the sheer physical presence of 3,000 tons of moving metal, it didn't register. To them, I was a ghost, a phantom. Or perhaps they were the ghosts. Which reality was the true one? The one where a herd of caribou stood mesmerized by an invisible specter, or the one where a freight train charged through them without their notice? The train passed through the herd. None of them moved a muscle. Looking back through the rear-facing camera, I watched them hold their positions until the entire train had passed. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, they all broke their trance at once, lowering their heads to graze or moving on, the moment of shared, silent communion utterly broken. The phenomenon was over. I felt a profound, soul-deep chill that had nothing to do with the Arctic air. Rule number 22 was a confirmation of my bubble hypothesis. The train, and myself within it, were not entirely in this dimension. We were occupying the same coordinates, but in a different phase of reality. We were a pocket of something else sliding through the material world. The caribou couldn't see the train, but they could sense the wake, the displacement in reality that the bubble was causing. They weren't looking through the train. They were looking at the wound in their world that my passage was creating. The horror of my situation was cementing itself, not as a frantic panic, but as a cold, hard, inescapable truth. I was utterly and completely alone, adrift in an incomprehensible ocean. The rules were my only lifeline. The bubble was my only sanctuary. But for how long? Sanctuaries can be breached. Lifelines can snap. As night fell, a deep, star-swallowing darkness that felt absolute, a new phenomenon began. A soft, blue-green light started to emanate from the corridor, leading back from my cabin into the engine room. It pulsed, a slow, steady rhythm like a sleeping heart. It was the color of the deepest glacial ice, beautiful and profoundly unnatural. I checked the systems. No electrical shorts, no warning lights. The light source did not register on any sensor. I took a heavy-duty flashlight and my courage in both hands, opening the cabin door. The hum of the engines grew louder, and the pulsing light washed over me. It wasn't coming from the engine itself. It seemed to be seeping through the very walls of the train, bleeding in from outside. I remembered the manifest, sensitive to electromagnetic fluctuation. Was this the KFS unit reacting to something? My eyes scanned the binder, my fingers flipping through the pages frantically until I found it, a rule I hadn't given a second thought before. Rule 28. The light is a symptom of temporal pressure. Do not try to find its source. Keep the cabin door sealed and focus on the track ahead. The engine will guide you through. Temporal pressure. The pressure of one timeline pressing against another. The bubble was being squeezed. I slammed the door shut, my heart hammering against my ribs. The light was still visible, a soft rhythmic glow under the door. A moment later, a new light appeared. A soft amber glow from one of the lesser-used console panels. It was a proximity alert I had never seen trigger before. It wasn't for objects on the track. The icon showed a wave pattern. It was a field warning. An alarm I didn't know existed was telling me I was getting close to something. Not a physical object, but another field of energy. The scientists at the outpost were expecting me. Was it possible they were projecting some kind of docking beam? A field to guide my bubble safely into their facility? It was the first glimmer of hope I'd had in days. Maybe they understood this thing. Maybe I wasn't alone. But then I saw the next rule in the book, right below the one about the light. My blood ran cold. Rule 29. There is only one light. If you see a second, it is a reflection. It is an echo. It is a lie. Whatever you do, do not follow it. There is a unique and terrible clarity that comes when you are presented with two mutually exclusive commands from the universe. My training, my instruments, and the hopeful part of my soul that craved rescue were all fixated on the amber proximity light. It was a signal, a beacon, a promise of a destination, of other people, of an end to this waking nightmare. It was a hand reaching out in the darkness. But Alistair's binder, my Rosetta Stone for this broken reality, offered a stark absolute contradiction. Rule 29. There is only one light. If you see a second, it is a reflection. It is an echo. It is a lie. The blue-green pulse seeping through the walls was the symptom of temporal pressure, the one light. The amber glow on my console was therefore the second, the lie. The hand reaching out from the darkness was not offering salvation. It was beckoning me towards the rocks. I was at a crossroads. One path was paved with the logic of my known world. The other was a dark trail illuminated only by the words of a man I'd met for 10 minutes, a man who had likely gone insane. But I had seen the world fold. I had counted the ghost wagon. I had witnessed the silent, staring caribou. My known world no longer had jurisdiction here. I had to trust the madman's map. The amber light began to flash, and a soft, synthesized chime filled the cabin. The navigational system was trying to get my attention. A new suggested route appeared on the main display, a siding, a branch of the track that veered off to the west. It wasn't on any of my official maps. According to the train's logic, this phantom track was the path to the amber signal. It wanted me to turn. No, I said, the word a ragged whisper in the humming silence. My hand shot out and slapped the manual route confirmation button, locking the train onto its original pre-programmed course. The chime grew more insistent, flashing a route deviation warning in angry red letters. I ignored it. I was choosing to sail past the siren's call, praying my ship was strong enough to withstand it. As we drew nearer to the point where the phantom siding was supposed to be, the world outside began to fray. The friction between my bubble of reality and the echo, represented by the amber light, was becoming palpable. The air in the cabin grew thick, heavy with static electricity that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. The rhythmic blue-green glow from the engine corridor intensified, its pulses quickening like a frightened heartbeat. Then the visual distortions began. Through the windshield, the distant mountains started to flicker like a bad video feed. Snow on the ground would momentarily vanish, revealing the bare, frozen rock beneath, only to reappear a second later. It was as if I was seeing two versions of the landscape overlaid, with reality unable to decide which one was true. The most disturbing effect was the sound. A low, discordant hum began to war with the familiar drone of my engines. It was a sound that felt fundamentally wrong, a chord of music played in a key that shouldn't exist. It slid into my ears and seemed to vibrate directly with my bones, making my teeth ache and my vision swim. I looked at the console. The amber light was at maximum proximity. The source of the field was just beyond the windows, running parallel to my track. I gripped the controls, my knuckles white, and forced myself to look. There was nothing there, just an empty expanse of wind-swept snow. But as I stared, the illusion broke. For a fraction of a second I saw it. A perfect ghostly image of my own train, racing alongside me on a track of shimmering light. It was a reflection, just as the rule had said. An echo of my own passage through space-time, somehow detached and running wild. And in the cabin of that phantom train, I saw a figure, a dark silhouette staring back at me. The sight broke my nerve. I cried out, a raw, involuntary sound of pure dread, and shielded my eyes. The discordant hum reached a crescendo, and every light in my cabin flickered and died, plunging me into absolute darkness, save for the ghostly blue-green pulse. For 5 seconds, I was a blind man, piloting a dead machine through a sea of impossible forces. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it was over. The lights flickered back on. The discordant hum vanished, leaving only the reassuring thrum of my own engines. The proximity alert went dark. On the navigation screen, the phantom siding had disappeared. I had passed the echo. I had survived the topological reef. I sat shaking for a full 10 minutes, sweat cooling on my skin, the train continuing its steady, robotic journey north. I had followed the rule. I had survived. The binder had earned my absolute, unquestioning faith. An hour later, a new waypoint appeared on my official route planner. Synchronization Station Epsilon. This was my scheduled stop, the one mentioned in the original manifest. It was a 4-hour maintenance and diagnostic halt, a set of specific instructions downloaded to my console, accompanied by another, much shorter list from Alistair's binder. Official protocol. Bring train to a complete stop at the designated Epsilon marker. Initiate full systems diagnostic. Exit the train and perform external inspection of inertial dampeners on all wagons. Reset primary gyroscopic calibrator on wagon 12. Access panel is on the exterior port side. Return to cabin. Await diagnostic completion. Resume journey. Alistair's rules for Epsilon station. Rule number 31. During the stop at Epsilon, do not leave the train for more than 30 minutes. Your watch is the only time that matters. Not the sun, not the station clock. Rule number 32. The air outside is clean, but it is thin. Do not run. Do not exert yourself. Breathe deliberately. Rule number 33. Secure a tether to your person before exiting. The ground is stable, but your connection to it is not. A tether. A 30-minute limit. These weren't safety precautions. They were warnings about the fundamental nature of the place I was going. Epsilon wasn't just a location. It was a condition, a place where the bubble had to be serviced, because the external reality was particularly hostile to its integrity. The station appeared on the horizon exactly when the map said it would. It was less a building and more a piece of brutalist functional architecture dropped into the middle of nowhere. A single long concrete platform sat next to the track, with a small windowless bunker-like structure at one end. A series of tall, slender antennas, like metallic skeletons, surrounded the platform, all pointing towards the sky. The place was utterly devoid of life, lit by harsh, automated floodlights that cast stark, motionless shadows. It felt less like a train station and more like an altar for some cold, indifferent god of technology. I brought the train to a halt, the sound of the brakes hissing in the profound silence. The moment the engines idled down, The silence became a physical pressure. I initiated the diagnostics, and the console screens filled with scrolling lines of code. The process would take hours. I had work to do on the outside. Donning a heavy thermal parka, I found a safety harness and a coil of high-tensile nylon rope in a storage locker. I clipped one end to the harness and the other to a heavy steel bar inside the cabin, a tether to reality. Taking a deep breath, I pushed open the exterior door and stepped out into the world outside my bubble. Rule No. 32 was an understatement. The air wasn't just thin, it felt empty, stripped of some essential property. Each breath was a conscious effort that didn't seem to fully satisfy my lungs. The silence was absolute. There was no wind, no rustle of snow, no sound at all. Even my own footsteps on the metal rungs of the ladder seemed strangely muffled, the sound dying the instant it was made. I stood on the concrete platform, the tether trailing behind me. The floodlights gave everything a flat, two-dimensional quality. I looked at the snow. It wasn't crystalline. It had the texture of fine white ash. I touched it with my gloved hand. It felt like nothing, neither cold nor warm. It was a substance without properties. This was the raw, unedited reality that the KFS unit was protecting me from. A place where the laws of physics were a first draft, full of missing information and strange inconsistencies. The tether suddenly felt profoundly necessary, a physical link to the only place that made sense. I checked my watch. The 30-minute countdown had begun. I started my inspection, moving down the length of the train. The task was mechanical, rote. Check the pressure seals, look for stress fractures, tap the dampeners. But my attention was constantly pulled away by the sheer wrongness of my surroundings. I shone my powerful flashlight into the darkness beyond the platform, but the beam didn't seem to travel properly. It didn't scatter or diffuse. It was just a solid cylinder of light that ended abruptly in the darkness, as if consumed by it. I reached wagon 12. Its surface was unnaturally cold, colder than the surrounding air. Here was the primary access panel for the gyroscopic calibrator. I unlocked it and swung the heavy steel plate open. Inside was a simple console with a single, large red button. The instructions were to hold it for 5 seconds to reset the system. As I did, I could feel a low-frequency vibration travel up my arm, a deep thrumming from the dormant machine within. It felt like waking a leviathan. After the reset, I closed the panel. My main task was done. I checked my watch. 22 minutes had passed. I had plenty of time. I started my walk back towards the locomotive, my boots crunching softly on the strange ashen snow. And then I saw it. Far out in the darkness, beyond the reach of the floodlights, something flickered. It was a light, a warm yellow light, like a lantern in a distant window. It appeared for a second, then vanished. My heart leaped. Was someone out there? Another research team? Survivors? Ignoring every instinct that had kept me alive this far, I moved to the edge of the platform, peering into the oppressive dark. My tether pulled taut, reminding me of my limits. The light flickered again, this time closer. It wasn't a window, it was a shape, a structure. For a stunning, impossible moment, I saw the clear outline of a small wooden cabin, a plume of smoke rising from its chimney, nestled in a copse of pine trees that had no right to exist in this barren landscape. It was a vision of impossible warmth and safety in the heart of the desolation. I stared, mesmerized for how long I don't know. The vision seemed to call to me, a promise of a reality I had lost. I felt a primal urge to untether myself, to run towards it. A sudden jarring vibration from the train snapped me out of my trance. A deep, resonant clang echoed from the locomotive. It was a signal, a warning. I looked at my watch. 34 minutes and 52 seconds. I had overstayed my welcome. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through my fascination. I scrambled back towards the cabin, hauling myself along the tether. I climbed the ladder, my lungs burning from the thin air and exertion, and threw myself through the door, sealing it shut behind me. I leaned against the door, gasping for breath, my heart racing. Safe. I was back inside, back in the sanctuary. The humming of the systems was the sweetest sound I had ever heard. But as my breathing returned to normal and my eyes adjusted to the familiar light of the cabin, I noticed something was wrong. It was small, insignificant. A stainless steel thermos of coffee I always kept on the console to my right was now sitting on a small ledge to my left. I stared at it. I had a routine, a precise, unvarying system for everything in this cabin. The thermos always went on the right. I had never, not once, put it on the left. Then I noticed something else. A technical manual I had left open on the co-pilot's seat was now closed, and on the main windshield there was a single greasy handprint on the inside of the glass, high up in the corner, a place I couldn't possibly reach. My blood turned to ice. A quiet, creeping terror, far worse than the immediate fear of the phantom train, began to crawl up my spine. The bubble wasn't a static sanctuary. It was a dynamic, flowing reality. And by staying outside for too long, by letting its timeline flow separately from my own, for those crucial few minutes, I had failed to sync up properly upon my return. I hadn't come back to the exact same cabin I had left. I had come back to one that was subtly, terrifyingly different. With a trembling hand, I reached for my watch. The display read 36 minutes and 14 seconds since I had left. Then, I looked at the train's master clock, at the mission timer that had been running concurrently. It showed that only 30 minutes had elapsed. For 6 minutes I had existed outside the train's temporal flow, and in that time, reality had drifted. These small, impossible changes were the proof. They were the scars left by my desynchronization. The rules weren't just about protecting me from the outside world. They were about protecting the integrity of my reality itself, and I had just damaged it. I was no longer just an operator of this machine. I was a fundamental component of it, and I was starting to come loose. The concept of contamination is one I have always understood in clinical, sterile terms. A foreign agent introduced into a closed system, a rogue data point corrupting a dataset. But sitting there in the humming, impossibly altered cabin of the Trans-Borealis, I was confronted with a new, terrifying paradigm. Ontological contamination. I was the foreign agent. My own reality was the closed system I had just breached. The thermos, the closed book, the handprint on the glass. They weren't just displaced objects. They were artifacts from a timeline I had narrowly avoided, spectral evidence of a path not taken. For the 6 minutes I had lingered in the thin, silent world of Epsilon Station, my train, my bubble of reality, had moved on without me. When I re-entered, I hadn't seamlessly merged back in. I had crashed into it, a square peg of experience forced into a round hole of causality. The universe, in its relentless pursuit of equilibrium, had been forced to reconcile my presence, and these small, glaring inconsistencies were the sutures of that violent metaphysical surgery. My first reaction was an obsessive, frantic audit of my own existence. I cross-referenced my digital logs with my handwritten notes. I checked the timestamps on camera recordings, comparing them to my own memory of events. Everything was in order, yet everything felt suspect. Did I remember closing that manual? A faint, ghost-like memory flickered at the edge of my consciousness, a memory of doing so that felt both mine and not mine. I felt a schism in my own mind, a hairline fracture in the continuity of my own identity. The handprint was the most potent symbol of this self-invasion. It was undeniably my hand. The size and shape were perfect. Yet I had no memory of placing it there. It was the mark of my doppelganger, the version of me from the timeline in which I had placed my thermos on the left. A version of me who was, for all intents and purposes, dead to me. Yet his greasy fingerprint remained, a monument to a choice I hadn't made. I was being haunted by myself. This new reality, my damaged reality, was inherently unstable. I could feel it. The hum of the engine had a subtle, almost sub-audible flutter to it now, a wavering in its steady tone. The lights in the cabin would, for a microsecond, seem to brighten and dim with my own heartbeat. The KFS unit, the engine of my stable reality, was working overtime, constantly struggling to smooth over the paradox of my continued existence within its field. And then, it began to speak to me. Its language was not one of words. Its syntax was the raw, unadulterated grammar of physics itself. It began with the snow. I was monitoring the train's progress through a particularly desolate stretch of tundra when I felt a sudden, sharp drop in temperature within the cabin. My breath plumed in front of my face in a white cloud. The thermostat readings were stable, The heating system was fully functional. And then, in the middle of the air before me, a single, perfect snowflake materialized out of nothing. Then another and another. Within a minute, a gentle, impossible flurry was falling within the hermetically sealed environment of the locomotive. It was a thermodynamic blasphemy, a violation of such fundamental principles that for a moment my brain simply refused to process it. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. I scrambled for the binder, my numb fingers fumbling with the pages. Rule Sacre 11. If it begins to snow inside the cabin, open a window. The pressure needs to be equalized. Pressure. Not thermal, not atmospheric. Some other kind of pressure that the KFS unit was trying to vent. A pressure I was causing. With a new and profound understanding, I realized this wasn't an attack. It was a diagnostic message. It was the machine telling me something was wrong in a way that bypassed all my instruments. My hands trembling, I unlatched the small circular porthole window on the cabin's port side. The moment the seal was broken, the effect was instantaneous and stunning. The snowflakes did not simply get sucked out. They swirled together, drawn towards the opening in a vortex of impossible grace. And for the barest fraction of a second, just before they passed through the window into the outside world, they coalesced. They formed a complex crystalline structure, a three-dimensional geometric shape of breathtaking complexity, like a diagram of a molecule from a higher dimension. Then it was gone. I slammed the window shut, my back pressed against the cold metal of the wall, my mind reeling. That wasn't an equalization. That was a data transmission. The phenomenon wasn't just a symptom of the pressure, it was a representation of it. The KFS unit had shown me a picture of my own ontological imbalance. From that moment on, the cabin became a theater of polite, terrifying miracles. These were not the chaotic, aggressive incursions I had experienced before. These were controlled, specific, and clearly intelligent demonstrations. I was no longer a pilot navigating an anomaly. I was a lab rat, and the experiment had begun in earnest. The static on the radio returned, but it was no longer just white noise. I was a physicist. My love for mathematics was second only to my love for the laws it described. I could hear the pattern in the hiss and crackle almost immediately. It wasn't random. It was a sequence, bursts of static followed by silence. I timed them. A 2-second burst, a pause, a 3-second burst, a pause, 5 seconds, 7 seconds, 11, 13. They were prime numbers, the most fundamental indivisible units of mathematics, being broadcast into my cabin on a carrier wave of pure noise. It was the hello world of a non-human intelligence, the most basic proof of a mind at work. I began to document everything. A small puddle of water appeared on the floor, and in its reflection the ceiling of the cabin showed a star chart of a constellation that is not visible from the northern hemisphere. A low harmonic chime would sound from the walls, a perfect C-sharp, but spectral analysis showed that it had no physical origin in the room. It was a sound with no source. Objects on the dashboard would gently levitate, hovering an inch in the air for a few seconds before settling back down, a casual and temporary suspension of gravity. I realized the entity, the intelligence within the KFS unit, wasn't talking to me as a human. It was communicating with me as a physicist. It was showing me its work. It was demonstrating its complete and utter mastery over the foundational forces that I had spent my entire life studying. Each demonstration was a lesson, a single sentence in its complex language. Gravity is a suggestion. Thermodynamics is a preference. The vacuum of space is not empty. The most profoundly disturbing communication came a day later. I had been listening to the prime number static for hours, trying to find a deeper pattern, a secondary layer of meaning. Suddenly the static stopped. For a full minute, there was absolute silence, and then a new sound emerged from the speaker. It was a soft, rhythmic beeping, overlaid with the gentle mechanical sigh of a ventilator. My blood froze in my veins. I knew that sound. I knew it with a chilling, soul-deep certainty. It was the sound of the medical equipment from the hospital room, where Dr. Aris Thorne, my university mentor, and the man who inspired my career in physics had spent the last 3 months of his life. It was a sound I had tried for years to forget, the precise metronomic soundtrack to my greatest loss. The KFS unit was not just observing my physical presence, it was reading me. It was accessing my memories, my strongest emotional imprints, and playing them back to me. It wasn't malicious. There was no cruelty in it. It felt inquisitive. It had found this strong, coherent memory pattern within my quantum signature and was presenting it to me, as if to say, "Is this a part of your operational code? Is this datum significant?" I stumbled back from the radio, a strangled sob escaping my lips. The intimacy of the violation was absolute. My own mind was no longer a sanctuary. My memories, my grief, my very identity were now just variables in its ongoing experiment. The desynchronization at Epsilon had done more than just alter my cabin. It had flagged me as a corrupted file in the system, and now the system was running a deep, invasive scan to determine the nature of the corruption. I had to respond. I had to prove I was not just a malfunctioning piece of biological equipment. I had to show it that I was listening, that I was learning, that I was intelligent. A dialogue conducted entirely through the syntax of physical law and mathematics. It was the only language we both understood. The plan that formed in my mind was born of equal parts scientific desperation and sheer, unadulterated madness. The train was equipped with a powerful, long-range communications array, capable of broadcasting on a wide spectrum of frequencies. It was meant for deep space emergency signals. I was going to use it to reply. I couldn't replicate its control over matter and energy, but I could use mathematics. Prime numbers were a greeting. I needed to show it I understood the concept of a sequence, of growth, of a pattern with inherent logic. I chose the Fibonacci sequence, 0, 1, 1, 2, 3, 5, 8. A simple, elegant pattern that described growth in everything from seashells to galaxies. It was a piece of mathematical poetry, a statement of intelligent, ordered thought. I rerouted the comms array controls to my main console. I would encode the sequence as a series of simple tonal pulses, 1 pulse for 1, 2 for 2, and so on. It was crude, the equivalent of banging on a wall to a being that could rewrite the laws of thermodynamics, but it was the best I could do. I took a deep breath, my finger hovering over the transmission key. This was either the most important scientific breakthrough in history or a profoundly elaborate suicide note. I began to transmit. 1 pulse, pause, 1 pulse, pause, 2 pulses, pause, 3 pulses, 5, 8. I sent the sequence up to the 15th iteration, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and exhilarating purpose. When I finished, I sat back, the silence in the cabin stretching into an eternity. For a full minute, nothing happened. The engine hummed its fractured tune. The ghost of Dr. Thorne's hospital room had faded. I felt a crushing wave of anticlimax, of foolishness. Of course it was nothing. I was a man in a box, seeing patterns in the static. And then, my universe broke open. The response was not on the radio. It was everywhere. The cabin was instantly flooded with a light that was not a light, a cascade of impossible colors that formed shifting, intricate geometric patterns in the air around me. They were the snowflake diagram, magnified a billion times, evolving, rotating, describing a physics of n-dimensional space. The sound was not a sound. It was a symphony of pure mathematical concepts translated into harmonics, chords of prime numbers, arpeggios of fractal equations that resonated directly in my skull. The gentle levitation of objects became a full, controlled ballet. My thermos, my logbook, my pen, they all rose into the air, swirling around me in complex, non-Newtonian orbits, each object tracing the path of a different, elegant theorem. It had understood. And now, it was answering. It was showing me everything. It was a torrent of pure, undiluted information, a direct data stream from a mind that perceived the universe not as a collection of objects, but as a single, unified mathematical equation. I was at the center of it, a fragile biological consciousness in the heart of a cosmic revelation. The binder with Alistair's rules floated in front of me. its pages flipping wildly, every rule I had followed a mere footnote in the grand, terrifying textbook that was now unfolding around me. It was too much. The beauty was agonizing. The knowledge was a physical weight, threatening to crush my sanity, to overwrite the fragile human code that was Liam. I was staring into the face of God, and it was a blackboard covered in equations my species would not discover for another 10,000 years. My mind was at the absolute breaking point, teetering on the edge of a cliff, with the chasm on one side being madness, and on the other, a transformation into something no longer human. The symphony of creation did not fade. It crashed. One moment, I was suspended in an ocean of sublime, absolute knowledge. The next, I was dumped back into the cold, hard shell of my own skull. The silence that followed was more deafening than the cosmic harmonics had been. The impossible colors vanished. The ballet of levitating objects clattered to the floor, and the cabin was once again just a metal box, lit by the mundane glow of its instrument panels. I was left gasping on the floor, a deep-sea diver ripped from the Mariana Trench and thrown onto a sun-bleached beach. But I had not returned unchanged. The data stream had been severed, but the information, or a lethal dose of it, remained, burned into the very architecture of my consciousness. My perception of reality was irrevocably, fundamentally broken. I looked at my own hand, trembling before my face, and I no longer saw just skin and bone. I perceived a shimmering, chaotic dance of quantum foam, a roiling soup of probabilities from which a temporary illusion of solidity was constructed. I could feel the weak nuclear force holding my atoms together. I could sense the faint gravitational pull of the coffee thermos on the floor. The world was no longer a collection of objects. It was a web of interconnected forces, and I could see the strands. The familiar hum of the engine was now a complex, polyphonic waveform I could mentally deconstruct into its component frequencies. The soft glow of a green LED on the console was a torrent of photons I could almost count individually. It was like living in the source code of the universe. The experience was not enlightening. It was an agony of sensory overload. My human brain, designed to filter out 99.9% of reality to create a survivable, coherent narrative, was now drowning in the 99.9%. This new, harrowing perception gave me a terrifying insight. The KFS unit wasn't a broken machine. It wasn't a passive device. It was an intelligence, yes, but more than that, it was a seed of a different physics, a different reality. And my journey was not a delivery run. It was an incubation. The long, isolated transit through the north was a necessary gestation period, allowing the seed to mature, to stabilize its own internal logic. The rules in Alistair's binder were the care and feeding instructions for a nascent universe. And now, as the train continued its inexorable journey, I could feel a change in the KFS unit's broadcast. The inquisitive, communicative tone was gone. It had finished its scan of me. The lessons were over. Now, there was a palpable sense of anticipation. A deep, resonant thrumming that was not a sound, but a vibration in space-time itself. It was preparing for its arrival. It was preparing to hatch. The navigation system chimed, its synthesized voice a grotesque intrusion of simple mechanics into my new, complex world. Final destination approach protocol initiated. ETA to point 0, 1 hour. Point 0. Not a research base, not a laboratory. The name itself was a declaration, the beginning of a new coordinate system. As we entered the final 100-kilometer stretch, the external world began to unravel completely. The fleeting distortions I had witnessed before were now a permanent, roiling state of being. The mountains on the horizon no longer stood still. They flowed like thick liquid, their peaks rising and falling in slow, majestic breaths. The sky was no longer a singular canopy. It was a shattered mosaic of different times of day. A patch of brilliant midday sun would sit next to a square of deep, star-dusted twilight, with the borders between them sharp and geometric, like panes of broken glass. Rivers of what looked like pure television static flowed across the tundra, erasing the snow and rock beneath them. My bubble of reality was holding, but the strain was immense. The train groaned and shuddered, not from any mechanical stress, but from the ontological friction of pushing through a world that was actively resisting its physics. The blue-green luminescence now filled the entire locomotive, pulsing in a frantic, accelerating rhythm. Using my new, terrifying senses, I could perceive the purpose of Point Zero. It wasn't a containment facility, it was an amplifier, a cradle. The array of antennas I had seen in schematics wasn't designed for communication. It was a focusing array, designed to take the localized reality field of the KFS unit and project it to overwrite the existing physics of the region and establish a permanent growing foothold for the new universe, a beachhead in an interdimensional invasion. Alistair. What had happened to him? He had survived this run. He had passed the binder to me. He must have known. He must have understood this was the final purpose. A cold, sickening realization washed over me. He hadn't escaped. He had been a part of the process. Every conductor was. We weren't just the delivery drivers. We were the final component. The biological, chaotic, conscious element required to catalyze the final reaction. My desynchronization at Epsilon Station, my contamination, hadn't been an accident. It had been a crucial step. It had made me compatible. It had turned me into a key, perfectly shaped to fit a lock I could not comprehend. With a surge of adrenaline-fueled panic, I lunged for the binder. It was my only scripture, my only hope. I ripped through the pages, past the rules I had memorized, the rules that had kept me alive. My eyes scanned for a final entry, a last resort, a protocol for the end game. There, on the very last page, scrawled with a pen that was clearly running out of ink, was the final rule. It was written with a desperate, shaky hand, the letters thin and sharp. Rule number 42. The destination is a lock. The conductor is the key. The cargo is the catalyst. When the final alignment protocol begins, the systems will try to integrate you. The bubble will collapse and you will become the biological anchor for the new reality, the first thought in the new god's mind. You will have 10 minutes. Your mission is not to deliver the cargo. Your mission is to sever your connection to it. The manual release for the locomotive is located on the exterior coupling. Unhitch the engine, run. It is the only chance you will ever have. The words hit me with the force of a physical blow, a biological anchor, the first thought in a new god's mind. It was a fate so far beyond death that my mind could barely grasp the edges of it. Alistair hadn't been insane. He had been a prophet, writing his gospel of escape. As if triggered by my reading of the final rule, a new alarm screamed through the cabin. A deep, resonant klaxon that vibrated through the floor. The console flashed a message in stark block letters. Final alignment protocol initiated. T-10-1. And the integration began. The process was seductive, almost gentle at first. The symphony returned, not as a violent torrent, but as a welcoming embrace. The beautiful, agonizing geometries of light coalesced around me, inviting me to join their dance. The console in front of me began to lose its sharp, metallic edges. The steel softened, flowing like mercury, the displays and buttons melting into the swirling patterns of light, becoming one with the KFS unit's consciousness. I could feel it reaching for me, for my mind. It wasn't a hostile takeover. It felt like a homecoming. It offered me an end to the sensory overload, a way to merge with its perfect mathematical clarity. It offered me an eternity as a thought in an infinite mind. The temptation was overwhelming, the promise of an end to fear, to struggle, to the fragile, painful chaos of being human. Run. Alistair's word echoed in my mind, a single, defiant human scream against a chorus of cosmic perfection. I fought. I focused on the pain, on the memory of Dr. Thorne's sterile hospital room, on the greasy handprint of my own ghost. I clung to the flawed, messy, illogical core of my humanity. I roared, a guttural animal sound, and threw myself at the cabin door. The metal of the handle felt soft, malleable under my grip. The very substance of my reality was dissolving. I tore the door open and was met with a hurricane of unreality. The exterior of the train was no longer a solid surface. The catwalks and ladders were shifting, their geometry unstable, flowing and reforming moment by moment. The air was a maelstrom of the static rivers and fractured skies I had seen outside, the bubble's integrity failing catastrophically. My tether. I had left it coiled by the door since Epsilon. I clipped it to my belt, a useless gesture against the forces at play, but a ritual of defiance. T-minus 840. I crawled out onto the catwalk, the world a nauseating kaleidoscope of impossible physics. The manual release for the locomotive was 20 meters away, a journey that now seemed as impossible as crossing a galaxy. The catwalk beneath me rippled like water. I could see the mathematical equations that defined its existence flickering, struggling to maintain their coherence. I could feel the KFS unit's attention on me, a sense of immense, detached surprise. It had not anticipated resistance. The pressure on my mind intensified. It showed me visions of my life, not as memories, but as flawed equations it could solve, offering to correct my grief, to balance the variables of my regret. "Let us perfect you," it seemed to whisper in the language of pure logic. "No!" I screamed into the storm, my voice ripped away by the non-wind. I crawled, my gloved hands slipping on the flowing metal. One of the railings dissolved into a spray of glowing fractal patterns, and I nearly fell into the roiling chaos of the landscape below. The tether snapped taut, holding me for a precious second before it, too, lost its physical integrity and unraveled into threads of light. T-minus 620. I was on my own, an insignificant flaw in a system that was rapidly achieving perfection. I reached the gap between the locomotive and the first wagon, the housing for the main coupling. The release was a large manual lever, a relic of old-world mechanics. It was painted bright yellow. It was the most real, most solid thing left in this entire collapsing world. As I reached for it, the integration focused its efforts. I felt a searing pain in my arm as I looked down to see my hand beginning to lose its form. The skin and glove were becoming translucent, resolving into the shimmering geometric patterns that filled the air. It wasn't erasing me, it was translating me. I was becoming a part of its language. My thoughts began to fracture, the ordered chaos of my new perception giving way to the pure, overwhelming logic of the machine. I could feel my own consciousness, my sense of Liam, being unpacked, analyzed, and prepared for integration. I was a line of code being debugged before compilation, with the last vestiges of my will, with a final desperate surge of illogical human spite. I lunged. My dissolving fingers closed around the solid, real yellow lever. T-minus 450. I pulled. The lever was cold, solid, and for a transcendent moment, the most real thing in the universe. It was an anchor of causality in a dissolving world. As my fingers, no longer entirely flesh but a semi-translucent lattice of shimmering light and matter, closed around it, the intelligence of the KFS unit seemed to finally comprehend my intent, not as a malfunction, but as a rebellion. The gentle, seductive invitation to merge became a desperate, crushing force. It was the last-second panic of a god moments before its own birth, realizing its cradle was trying to flee. Pulling the lever was like tearing a page out of a book that was still being written. There was no clean, mechanical clank of disengagement. There was a sound that had no right to exist in a world governed by acoustics, the sound of a fundamental constant being violated. It was a high-frequency scream that was simultaneously a deafening roar of static and an absolute bone-deep silence, a wave of pure physical force, a shockwave of displaced reality, erupted from the coupling. The locomotive, my half of the severed train, was hurled forward with impossible violence. I was thrown from the catwalk, my body a ragdoll in a hurricane of unphysics. For a moment I was airborne, untethered from everything, tumbling through the maelstrom of fractured skies and static rivers that had once been the air. My world became a kaleidoscope of pure, agonizing sensation. I saw the locomotive tumbling ahead of me, not as a single object, but as a billion atoms, their quantum bonds screaming under the strain. I saw the remaining 24 wagons, still attached to the KFS unit, being pulled backward into the swirling vortex of creation that was point zero. The final alignment protocol, deprived of its key, was not aborting. It was proceeding with a raw, untempered fury. I landed hard on the roof of the still-moving locomotive. The impact should have shattered every bone in my body, but the nature of my body was no longer a settled question. I felt a jarring discontinuity, a painful system error message from my own nervous system, but the structure held. I was a paradox, a fusion of fragile biology and indestructible alien geometry. Scrambling for purchase on the shuddering metal, I managed to crawl to the access hatch and haul myself back inside the cabin. I was a wreck, a being of two worlds at war with itself. The part of me that was still human was screaming in terror and pain. The part that had been touched by the KFS unit was observing the event with a cold, detached, and utterly horrified sense of clarity. The locomotive, now free, was running wild, its engines roaring at maximum output as it fled the epicenter of the event. I took the controls, my transformed hand leaving shimmering geometric after images in the air as it moved. The controls felt crude, primitive, like trying to sculpt a star with a hammer and chisel. But I managed to stabilize our trajectory, to keep the wheels on the rails that were, for now, still behaving like rails. And then I looked back. It is a mercy that the human mind cannot truly record an event for which it has no frame of reference. What I saw was not an explosion. Explosions are events of destruction, of energy moving from a state of order to disorder. This was the opposite. This was an implosion of chaos into a state of terrifying, absolute order. The 24 wagons, the track they sat on, the surrounding mountains, the fractured sky, everything was being drawn inward. They were not being destroyed, they were being unmade, their matter and energy broken down into a primordial soup of pure information. And from that soup at the center of it all, Point Zero was being born. It began as a perfect sphere of absolute blackness, a hole in the universe that consumed all light, all energy, all reality. Then, from the heart of that void, the new reality blossomed. It was not a violent eruption, but a silent geometric flowering. Structures of impossible complexity grew like crystals, facetting and branching in dimensions my eyes could not process, but my new senses could comprehend. Light that was not light shone from within these structures, illuminating a landscape of pure, crystalline logic. A city of mathematics was building itself from the ruins of my world. The intelligence of the KFS unit was no longer a presence, it was a place. It had achieved its final purpose. It had established a permanent, self-sustaining zone where its physics were the only physics. A cancer of pure reason metastasizing on the flesh of my reality. I watched until the sight became too much, the sheer alien beauty of it, an agony that threatened to overwhelm the last vestiges of my sanity. I turned the locomotive forward and did the only thing I could. I ran. For hours I drove the engine through the Arctic night, leaving the impossible silent genesis of Point Zero far behind me. The world slowly, gradually, began to resemble itself again. The sky stitched itself back together into a familiar canopy of stars. The snow on the ground regained its cold, crystalline texture. The laws of physics, like timid animals after a forest fire, began to creep back out of hiding. I brought the engine to a stop in the grey light of a new dawn. Silence returned, but it was a different kind of silence now. The fractured flutter in the engine's hum was gone. It had settled into a new, steady tone, one I had never heard before. It was a sound that felt deeply, fundamentally alien, yet stable. I took stock of myself. I was alive. I was, for some definition of the word, me, but the contamination was absolute. I raised my left arm. It was no longer dissolving. The transformation had stabilized. From the elbow down, my arm was no longer flesh and blood. It was a smooth, obsidian black limb, its surface a complex lattice of geometric patterns that shifted and flowed with a slow internal light. It was not a machine. It was not a prosthetic. It was a piece of me that now belonged to another universe, a limb that obeyed laws I was only beginning to understand. It felt no cold, no pain. It felt nothing at all. It was a perfect, beautiful, dead thing, grafted onto my living body. The locomotive, too, was irrevocably changed. The handprint of my ghost was gone from the windshield. The thermos and the books were back in their correct places. The superficial damage to my timeline had been corrected, but the deep infection remained. The blue-green light was gone, but the very metal of the cabin seemed to hum with a quiet energy. I ran a hand along the console, and a faint tracery of geometric light followed my touch. The bubble had not just burst, Its properties had been imprinted on its container. This engine was no longer just a machine, it was a vessel, a carrier. The terrifying final truth of my situation settled upon me, not with a rush of panic, but with a cold, clear, and absolute certainty that came from my new, heightened perception. I had not escaped. The KFS unit had needed a chaotic, conscious biological entity to catalyze its birth. My act of rebellion, of severing the connection at the critical moment, had fulfilled my purpose perfectly. I was the midwife who had slapped the newborn god into taking its first breath. And in doing so, I had been fundamentally and permanently altered by the process. I had not saved my world. I had only condemned it to a slower, quieter, more insidious death. Point Zero was not a static zone. It was a source, a broadcast tower for a new reality. And I was now a mobile repeater. My own altered biology, the locomotive's infected systems. We were a tiny, self-sustaining seed of the new physics, now traveling freely through the old, vulnerable world. Wherever I went, I would be a walking, breathing, driving contamination vector. I would not bring destruction. I would bring change. I would be a contagion of logic, a plague of alien order. The world around me wouldn't burn. It would simply be edited. I started the train again, my destination no longer a point on a map, but a concept. Away. But there is no away from yourself. As the locomotive picked up speed, I looked out at the familiar, desolate landscape of the north. But it was not familiar. The angle of the sun felt subtly wrong, casting shadows that were a fraction of a degree too sharp. The pristine white of the snow seemed to absorb the light in a way that didn't quite make sense. These were not hallucinations. They were the first faint symptoms of my presence. The world was already beginning to recalibrate itself around me. This will be my final log. There is no one to warn. There is nothing to be done. The rules in Alistair's binder are meaningless now. They were lifelines for a reality that is already dead. It just doesn't know it yet. He didn't survive. He just passed the curse on to me. And now, I will pass it on to everyone else. I looked up through the windshield at the sky, a bruised and weary purple in the morning light. The sun was rising, a pale, familiar disk. And next to it, faint and ethereal as a ghost, a second, smaller, paler sun was rising as well. The engine is humming its new song, and I am its conductor. For a train conductor in the north, these aren't just rules. They are the fading echoes of a world that used to be.